Donald Trump's voice didn't so much interrupt the CNN town hall as slice straight through it. The way a courtroom objection can change the temperature in the room before anyone knows what they're supposed to feel. Elizabeth Warren had been heading toward the wings after her segment, already half out of the spotlight, when she stopped like someone had just called her full name in a quiet church. The audience, about 200 people who'd spent the last hour nodding along to a familiar sermon about corporate greed, went still, the applause dying off in that awkward, startled way. Trump wasn't parked in the guest chair like a normal participant either. He stood at the moderator's table like he was there to cross-examine the entire set. And in that posture, with that timing, he didn't ask to be defended. He acted like he'd been invited to prosecute. "Senator Warren just spent 60 minutes calling me corrupt," he said. And he said it like he was reading a receipt out loud. "And since we're doing corruption tonight, I think it's only fair we talk about the money she made from the corporations she says she fights." Anderson Cooper tried to grab the wheel, because that's what moderators do when the car starts drifting toward the guardrail. But once the words were out, the moment belonged to the conflict, not the format. When Trump asked whether Warren was still in the building and suggested she come back out, the crowd didn't just react. They started chanting like they were at a sporting event. Backstage, you can picture the calculation happening in real time because it's the only calculation there ever is on live television. Walk away and look like you're ducking something, or walk back out and risk being caught flat-footed. Warren's staff huddled close, whispering the kind of urgent advice that always sounds calm on paper and never sounds calm in a hallway. The cameras were still rolling, which turns every choice into a performance whether you want it or not. And the audience was already chanting, "Bring her back," which is how a town hall turns into something closer to a public deposition. So she returned to the stage wearing the face politicians put on when they're trying to project confidence they don't currently possess. Trump placed a thick folder on the table, and when the contents slid out, contracts, statements, photocopies, the whole scene started reading less like a debate and more like an evidence dump. He didn't shout, he didn't grin for the camera, and that was the point. He delivered it in the calm tone that makes viewers think, whether rightly or wrongly, that they're watching facts instead of theater. He lifted one document, said "Traveler's Insurance," and called out a dollar figure, $212,000, like he was reading a price tag. He lifted another, then another, each time repeating the same rhythm: company name, date, money, and the insinuation that the work wasn't just consulting, but complicity. Warren looked down at papers that, in this story's framing, appeared to bear her signature, and you could feel the air thin out as people waited for a clean answer. To be clear, on television, clean answer almost always means simple answer, and simple answers are where complex careers go to die. Warren tried to speak in the language she knows best: bankruptcy procedure, expert testimony, legal norms, because that's the language that makes sense in a law school classroom. Trump kept pulling the discussion back to the moral translation, the version that fits in a viewer's head without footnotes. You helped powerful entities reduce what they paid out, and you got paid well to do it. That's the magic trick in political storytelling. Take a complicated set of facts, strip out the nuance, and replace it with a blunt narrative people can repeat to their friends. Whether the underlying allegations would hold up under real scrutiny isn't the only question on stage. The question is what lands in the gut on live TV. He named other companies, DAO Chemical in the text you provided, plus additional corporate names that the documents on his table were said to reflect. And each name acted like a new weight on the scale. Every time he let a sheet drop back to the table, it sounded like a gavel, which is exactly why that gesture is so effective. Warren tried to frame the work as legitimate and common for academics in her field, which is not an implausible defense in the abstract. But abstract is a hard sell when the camera is zoomed in on ink, signatures, and numbers. And because he had the rhythm, Trump also had the advantage. He controlled the pace at which the audience processed each claim. Cooper asked for clarification because he's the moderator, and the job description basically says, try to preserve some semblance of order. Warren attempted to widen the context, saying the legal work was being characterized unfairly and that bankruptcy matters don't fit neatly into soundbite morality. Trump responded by narrowing the frame again, calling the work what he wanted it to be called, and daring her to deny the payments on camera. If you've ever watched a public figure get pulled into a yes or no trap, you know the feeling. The person answering is trying to protect nuance, and the person asking is trying to make nuance look like evasion. The audience doesn't need to know who's right to know who looks cornered. Then the story shifts to what he calls her signature achievement, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And this is where the narrative tries to turn policy into scandal without ever pausing for the boring parts. Trump's claim, as presented in your text, is that settlement money went to organizations that critics could label as politically aligned, and he treats that as proof of a rigged pipeline. Warren pushes back by describing those recipients as legitimate service providers, housing counseling, community support, consumer education, because that's how the programs are typically defended. Trump pushes back again by reading descriptions of those groups through a political lens, implying activism where she sees outreach. And the audience is left watching two different translations of the same kind of bureaucratic mechanism, wondering which one to believe. On stage, this kind of argument is almost impossible to adjudicate because the evidence is rarely self-explanatory. A list of organizations and dollar amounts can look incriminating or benign depending on what the viewer already believes about the institutions involved. Trump uses the word slush fund in spirit, if not always in exact phrasing, because it's a compact moral verdict that requires no technical background. Warren responds with the language of programs and outcomes, because that's what a policy person reaches for when someone tries to reduce everything to a meme. But in a live confrontation, the person with the simpler story often wins the moment, even if the simpler story is missing half the picture. From there, the narrative moves into stock trades and timing, and this is where insinuation does a lot of the heavy lifting. Trump presents spreadsheets, dates, and examples, briefing followed by trade followed by market movement, like a pattern that speaks for itself. Warren says her investments are managed by an advisor, which is a real-world detail many officials cite, but it also can sound like "not me" to an audience that wants accountability with a face. Trump's framing suggests material non-public information, while Warren's framing suggests ordinary financial management and coincidence. The story doesn't need a courtroom to generate heat. It only needs the public to hear classified briefing and profitable trade in the same sentence and start connecting dots. And if you're trying to avoid outright accusations while still keeping tension high, you lean on questions. Could a pattern like that be explained by routine portfolio decisions? Or does the proximity to sensitive briefings raise reasonable concerns? Is the public supposed to be reassured by the presence of a financial advisor? Or is that just a professional buffer that doesn't change who benefits? How many trades are enough before coincidence becomes suspicious in the eyes of voters who already suspect the game is tilted? Those questions don't convict anyone, but they do what political TV loves most. They make viewers feel like detectives. The Pocahontas line is where the scene tilts from financial insinuation into identity politics, and the atmosphere changes instantly. Warren calls it offensive, Trump calls it accurate, and the argument becomes less about documents and more about whether the audience thinks a past controversy is settled or still relevant. In your provided story, Trump waives old faculty directories and diversity listings and frames them as proof of career advantage. Warren responds with family stories and lived belief, which, to supporters, can read as human and sincere, and to critics can read as evasive. The story's punch is the contrast between the smallness of percentages and the largeness of the political consequence, even though real life rarely fits neatly into that kind of math as morality. By this point, the town hall in the narrative has basically stopped being a Q&A and become an event with only one theme: answer the simplest version of the charge or look like you can't. Audience members start pressing for yes or no, which is the crowd's way of trying to take back control from rehearsed language. Warren keeps trying to rebuild context, and context is exactly what a hostile frame tries to deny you. Trump keeps returning to receipts, which is modern political shorthand for "I brought paper, therefore I'm right," even when paper can be incomplete or interpreted selectively. Cooper tries to thread the needle, but the needle keeps moving because the moment isn't about moderation anymore. It's about spectacle. At some point in the story, Warren walks off stage, and the walk-off does what walk-offs always do. It becomes the headline, no matter what the underlying substance was. Viewers don't remember the fine print. They remember the empty chair. The narrative then pivots into aftermath in the way political thrillers love to do it. Viral clips, overnight polls, donors panicking, party leaders calling with cold voices. It's written like a cascade, where every institution, media, donors, committees, regulators, moves in lockstep, each development amplifying the next. And because it's storytelling, it compresses time to make the collapse feel inevitable. Like the day after the town hall, everyone agrees on the same verdict. In real politics, unanimity is rare, which is why the most effective political fiction makes unanimity feel plausible. The story has MSNBC and CNN and major papers all treating the evidence as damning, because that's how you signal this isn't just partisan spin. It introduces formal investigations with official-sounding language, because official language makes suspicion feel like proof, even when it's still just suspicion. It adds donors with recognizable names making blunt phone calls, because money walking away is the clearest sign a politician's brand is in trouble. And it uses the phrase "toxic" in spirit, because nothing scares a party more than a figure who turns every camera toward the worst questions. The press conference sequence drives the same point home with a different setting. Reporters asking yes or no questions and a politician trying to answer in paragraphs. That mismatch is one of the oldest traps in American politics, and it's effective because it looks like the speaker is dodging, even when the speaker thinks they're explaining. In your narrative, Warren repeatedly returns to complexity, and the room repeatedly returns to numbers. The numbers don't have to prove criminality to be politically lethal. They only need to suggest a gap between the public persona and private benefit. And the more she resists the yes or no framing, the more the story paints her as someone who can't survive outside her preferred arena. Then comes the institutional fallout montage. Harvard Review, Bar Association scrutiny, Senate committee moves, leaders distancing themselves. The point isn't whether each step would happen exactly that way in real life. The point is the feeling of a door closing from every direction. The story even includes reputational losses, like canceled speaking engagements and tanking book reviews, because modern scandal is always economic as well as political. It uses voters, especially a betrayed supporter in the audience, to underline that this isn't merely a partisan hit job in the narrative's world, and it ends by shrinking the powerful figure into a private person with curtains drawn, which is how these arcs usually land. The public stage goes silent, and the private consequences linger. Now, If you're trying to tell this kind of story as an American political commentary voiceover without stepping into direct accusations, the trick is to keep your feet planted in what people saw, what people heard, and what people reasonably wondered. You don't say, "She committed crimes." You say, "The timing raised questions that wouldn't go away." You don't declare, "It was a scheme." You say, "Critics argued it looked like a pipeline, and supporters argued it looked like community restitution." You don't call anyone a villain. You describe the incentives and let viewers decide what they think it means. And you keep returning to the central irony, the thing audiences can't resist, without claiming you know what's inside anyone's heart. Here's the rewritten version in that spirit, with completely different wording, continuous prose, an American native commentary tone, line breaks every 5 sentences, and a steady reliance on doubt, observation, and pointed questions rather than direct charges. Donald Trump didn't wait for permission, and he didn't act like a guest who was grateful to be there. He stood at Anderson Cooper's table like he'd wandered onto a set built for someone else and decided to turn it into his own hearing. Elizabeth Warren had already started toward the exit after her segment, the way candidates do when they think they've landed their hits and can leave the other side stuck playing defense. Then Trump's voice cut in, sharp and clean, and Warren stopped mid-step, like she'd just heard the one sentence she wasn't expecting to hear on live television. In a room full of people who'd spent an hour applauding a sermon about corporate greed, the sudden silence sounded louder than applause ever does. Cooper tried to reset the moment, but the moment had already chosen its direction. Trump didn't argue that Warren had misrepresented him. He argued that she'd opened a door she didn't realize swung both ways. "If we're going to talk about corruption," he said, "then let's talk about yours." And he said it like he was reading from a checklist. It wasn't the volume that made the room tense. It was the confidence with which he implied he had paper to back up the provocation. People can disagree with a politician all day, but they lean forward when they think they're about to see documents. The crowd began chanting for Warren to come back, and that chant did what chants always do on TV. It turned a choice into a trap. Off stage, you could practically hear the whispered math, because everyone in politics knows the rule. Leave, and you look guilty. Return, and you risk looking unprepared. Warren's team clustered close to her, trying to find the one response that would sound strong without feeding the story's hunger for drama. But the cameras were still on, and once the cameras are still on, everything becomes a vote on optics. So Warren walked back out, shoulders square, smile tight, the practiced face of someone who has spent a career surviving hostile rooms. Trump set a thick folder on the table, and the gesture itself carried a message. "I didn't come here to riff, I came here to show." As the contents spilled out, contracts, statements, photocopies, he built the mood of a prosecutor without ever saying the word. He held up a sheet with a corporate letterhead and called out a number, and the number hung in the air like a heavy ornament nobody wanted to touch. He said, "Traveler's insurance," and then $212,000. And in that beat, the audience stopped being a crowd and started acting like a jury. Warren looked at the page the way you look at something you recognize but didn't expect to see enlarged on a screen. What does a viewer do with a contract on live TV, especially when the camera zooms in on a signature that appears to match the person sitting there? A viewer does what viewers always do. They assume the paper tells the truth, because paper feels more honest than rhetoric. Trump didn't spend long explaining bankruptcy law. He didn't need to, not for the purpose of a political moment. He translated the claim into a moral sentence, the kind that lands fast. You helped an insurance company limit what it paid to sick workers, and they paid you to help. And once you say it like that, The only immediate counter that works is a clean denial, not a seminar. Warren tried to respond the way a lawyer professor responds, which is to say, she tried to restore the missing context. She described expert testimony, routine practice, complex proceedings, and the role scholars play in courts when judges need someone to map a technical landscape. That defense can sound reasonable in daylight, especially to anyone who knows academia and the way consulting work functions at the top of it. But the camera doesn't love daylight. The camera loves contrast, and contrast is created by turning complex into dodging. Trump kept his tone flat and his pace steady, because calm makes an accusation feel more credible than anger does. Then he moved to another document and another company name, and the repeated rhythm did what repetition always does. It made the story feel bigger. The narrative didn't require the audience to understand environmental liability or pension restructuring. It only required them to understand the emotional translation. He said, a chemical company. He said, a leak. He said, the money. And then he implied Warren's role wasn't neutral analysis, but paid alignment. Warren tried to draw a line between providing expertise and taking sides, but the line was hard to see from the back row. And from a viewer's perspective, the line gets even blurrier when the numbers keep arriving like clockwork. Cooper asked Warren to respond to the specific figures, because that's what a moderator does when the room is starting to drift toward chaos. Warren tried to keep her footing by emphasizing that professional services are not the same thing as endorsing a client's conduct. Trump refused to debate that distinction and instead leaned on the part that plays on television. You took the checks, you signed the paperwork, you benefited. There's a reason that move works. It forces the audience to judge the person's ethics instead of the legal mechanics. And once the room is judging ethics, the person being judged is always one awkward pause away from looking like they're hiding something. At that point, the story took a familiar American turn, because in American politics, the worst sin isn't always wrongdoing, it's hypocrisy. If you brand yourself as the scourge of corporate power, the public expects you to have lived as if you believed your own brand. So the question becomes less, was this allowed? And more, does this match the image you sold to people who trusted you? Trump, in this narrative, understood that better than anyone, and he pressed that mismatch like it was a bruise. Warren, meanwhile, kept reaching for nuance, and nuance is rarely the friend of someone trying to survive a viral moment. Trump's next move in your story was to pivot from old consulting work to Warren's most famous policy legacy, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He treated the agency like a machine that can be explained in one breath, which is never how agencies work, but is often how they're framed on television. He argued that money extracted from banks through settlements ended up supporting organizations that look, to certain eyes, politically aligned. Warren argued that these organizations provide services, housing counseling, consumer education, community assistance, and that broad remedies can matter even when individual checks are hard to deliver. So the audience was left with a question that's easy to ask and hard to answer. When settlement money moves through nonprofits, where does restitution end and political advantage begin? Trump held up lists and charts, and the lists and charts did what lists and charts do. They created the feeling of a pattern. He implied intent, and he didn't need to prove intent on stage because the goal wasn't conviction, it was suspicion. Warren insisted the structure had a purpose tied to community benefit, not party benefit. And that is the kind of distinction policy people rely on. But critics don't need to accept the distinction to weaponize it. They only need the public to think it sounds plausible that the mechanism could be abused. And once that thought takes hold, the argument turns into an endless loop of "show me the receipts" versus "you're misunderstanding the program." That's when the town hall, at least in the story, becomes something else. less debate and more interrogation. The crowd starts asking for yes or no answers because yes or no feels like honesty, even when it forces misleading simplicity. Warren tries to explain because her instincts tell her that explaining is how you win. Trump tries to reduce because his instincts tell him that reduction is how you win. And on live TV, the person who controls the frame usually controls the verdict, even if that verdict is more emotional than factual. Next comes the stock trading section, where the narrative leans heavily on timing. Timing is one of those things that can be innocent in reality and damning in perception, depending on how many examples you string together. Trump goes trade by trade, briefing by trade, trade by market movement, and the audience watches the rhythm and starts expecting the same beat again. Warren says an advisor handles her investments, and viewers immediately split into two camps: those who hear standard practice and those who hear plausible deniability. And the unanswered question hovering over it all isn't, did you do something illegal? But should anyone in public office ever be in a position where this pattern can even be argued? If the goal is to keep the story in the realm of questions instead of declarations, you don't say insider trading, you say the timing invited scrutiny. You don't claim there was wrongdoing. You ask whether the public can trust a system where briefings happen behind closed doors and trades happen in open markets. You ask whether a blind trust would have prevented this entire argument from existing in the first place. You ask why lawmakers keep their financial arrangements structured in ways that allow public doubt to grow. And you let the audience sit in the discomfort of not knowing, because uncertainty is what keeps people listening. Then the story circles back to a controversy that has followed Warren for years: her claims about Native American ancestry. Trump invokes old university records in your narrative, and he frames those records as professional advantage rather than personal belief. Warren responds with family stories and upbringing, and her defenders would say that families pass down messy histories that aren't easily verified. Critics would say that family stories are not the same thing as identity, and that institutions shouldn't treat them as proof. The debate is emotionally explosive, which is why it's so often used as a political weapon, and why it instantly shifts the room from policy to identity. By then, the stage is crowded with paper and implication, and every new sheet feels like another weight on Warren's composure. Cooper tries to restore neutrality, but neutrality is hard when the audience has decided the story is answer the question. Warren tries to call it an ambush, and from her perspective, it probably feels like one, because she wasn't prepared to litigate decades of her career in one segment. Trump treats her unpreparedness as proof, because that's what political opponents do. They treat surprise as guilt, and guilt as spectacle. And the audience watches, not as constitutional scholars, but as human beings reading facial expressions for signs of fear or confidence. In your narrative, Warren eventually walks off, and that is the hinge where policy becomes pure optics. A walk-off can be self-protection. It can be exhaustion. It can be strategy. But on television, it almost always reads as surrender. Trump stays calm, gathers his papers, and speaks to the camera like he's wrapping up a case, not ending a segment. Cooper tries to close out, but the show is already over in the public mind, because the image that will travel isn't the moderator, it's the empty chair. And within minutes, the clip becomes the story, detached from context, detached from nuance, detached from any part of the night that didn't fit the collapse narrative. After that, the narrative goes into a familiar scandal spiral. Social media clips, headlines, panels, and the sensation that everyone is suddenly an expert in bankruptcy law and Senate ethics. The story describes poll drops that happen overnight, because scandal fiction loves speed. Speed makes the downfall feel like destiny. It describes donors calling to cut ties, because money is the most honest character in American politics. It describes party leaders offering cold distancing, because parties protect the brand the way corporations protect the brand. And it describes institutions opening reviews and inquiries, because official processes give the public a feeling that the suspicion has teeth. In the rewritten voice, you keep saying reports suggested and critics argued and viewers wondered, because that's how you maintain tension without declaring guilt. You describe how the evidence looked on screen rather than asserting what it would prove in court. You talk about the collision between a public image and a set of documents, because that collision is what people remember. You point out that politics rewards the person who can turn complicated systems into simple moral stories, even if the simplification is unfair. And you ask the big question that hangs over all of it. How many American careers are built on a brand that collapses the moment someone shows the backstage receipts? Warren, in this narrative, begins the day confident because she believes she controls the terrain. She has her statistics, her talking points, her practiced indignation, and her long history of translating complicated economics into moral clarity for voters. She expects to frame Trump as the symbol of a rigged system, and she expects the audience to be primed to accept that framing. That expectation isn't crazy. It's how modern political communication works. Whoever frames first often wins. But the story's twist is that Trump isn't there to defend. He's there to reverse the frame and force Warren to answer to her own contradictions. In Trump Tower, the narrative shows a preparation session built around opposition research, FOIA polls, and the thrill of "we've got paper." It's written like an investigation montage, because nothing sells like the feeling of a hidden file being opened. Trump's team, in this story, treats Warren's brand as the target, not her policies, because brands are what voters actually live with. They collect contracts, tax records, trading disclosures, and old institutional listings, and they arrange them like exhibits. And the plan is simple. Let her have her hour, then make her answer live while she's still flushed with the confidence of applause. At CNN studio, Warren's team believes they've won before Trump even arrives, because she landed her message and the crowd rewarded her. That confidence is the kind that often precedes a fall in these stories, because the audience wants to watch certainty crack. A production assistant asks her to stay just in case, and the phrase "just in case" is always a warning dressed like politeness. Warren agrees because declining would look like avoiding, and politics punishes avoidance even when avoidance is reasonable. Then Trump steps out, and, instead of sitting, he stands. And standing is a signal that the night's script is about to change. When he asks CNN to bring Warren back, the show's structure breaks. And once structure breaks, anything can happen. Warren returns to the stage and tries to label the moment inappropriate, because she needs the audience to see her as the grown-up. Trump ignores the etiquette argument and goes straight back to paper, because etiquette is weak against a folder full of printouts. Warren tries to answer in a way that preserves complexity, but the crowd keeps demanding the simplest possible response. And the tension builds because you can feel the gap widening between how Warren wants to talk and how the room wants to hear. In the late stages, the story paints the audience as shifting, not uniformly, but visibly, from applause to discomfort to judgment. That shift is what makes the scene feel consequential, because it suggests the confrontation pierced a friendly room rather than entertaining an enemy crowd. A woman stands up and says she supported Warren and wants a straight answer. And that kind of figure functions like a mirror in political narratives. Warren sees that mirror and struggles, because the story needs her to struggle to justify the collapse that follows. Trump uses the moment to restate his theme. She built a brand on righteousness, and now she can't survive her own paper trail. After the walk-off, the narrative leans into the way modern scandal replicates. Clips clipped into smaller clips, each smaller clip engineered by the internet to deliver one emotion. A pause becomes a meme. A grimace becomes a verdict. A non-answer becomes an admission, even when none of those things are legally what people claim they are. The media coverage in your story becomes a drumbeat, repeating the same numbers until the numbers feel like undeniable truth. The party turns cold, donors retreat, committees move, and institutions launch reviews, because the story wants to show that Warren isn't just losing an argument. She's losing oxygen. And the final image is Warren alone in a beautiful house that now reads less like success and more like an exhibit in the public's case against her brand. If you wanted to boil the entire narrative down to the question it's really asking, it's not, is she guilty? It's, is she believable? Politics rarely punishes wrongdoing as harshly as it punishes the appearance of two sets of rules, one for the speaker, one for the people listening. The audience can tolerate imperfection. What it hates is being preached at by someone who appears to have profited from the very practices they denounce. Trump, in this story, doesn't need to prove anything beyond reasonable doubt. He only needs to raise reasonable doubt about the sincerity of the crusader. And Warren, trapped between her own complexity and the audience's demand for simplicity, ends up losing control of the only thing a politician truly owns: the story people tell about them afterward.